Hello and welcome to this review of a Mikhail Botvinnik game. Botvinnik was a former world chess champion, for any beginners out there that didn't know that. So let's see what we can learn from Mikhail Botvinnik. This game takes place in 1953. Botvinnik has the white pieces. We see he played with 92% accuracy in this versus 80% by his opponent. So let's see how Mikhail Botvinnik wins this game. So he starts with e4 and then we have c5, the Sicilian defense. So, white basically stakes a portion of the center with this e4 pawn, and we have a counterattack on the queen side. And so, this move kind of discourages white from pushing his other pawn immediately. You can do that, but then your queen may end up on this square after an exchange, and it can be chased by a knight. So here we have knight to f3 first, preparing the d4 pawn push, and the game continues with knight to c6. So this is one of the many options in the Sicilian defense for black. We see that this pawn is fighting for control of d4, and the knight does that also in conjunction with the pawn. All right, so we have the d4 pawn push. So Botvinnik tries to take control with both his pawns in the center, and usually when that happens, you want to try and get rid of one of those pawns. And so the flank pawn captures the more valuable central pawn, but after recapture, white has more space, a knight that's centralized versus a cramped position by black, and a knight that's still back here on c6 on his half of the board. So the next common move here is to jump forward, attacking this unprotected pawn. So Botvinnik develops a knight, which helps control the center and protect the pawn. And we also see that this knight was preventing the pawn from pushing forward and harassing black's knight. So, or preventing white, from pushing forward, harassing this knight. Sometimes this pawn will move there to cover that square. So the game continues with the pawn pushing forward there now. And Botvinnik, how does he respond? Well, he just develops his bishop here, where it controls two different diagonals, and he's ready to castle to the king side. So now we have an interesting move. This is still a book move. We have an immediate attack on this knight, but by pushing this pawn to e5, there's a hole here, which could potentially be used as an outpost in the future for white. So here the knight retreats, and Khan, Botvinnik's opponent, he develops his bishop in the same manner. But if we look at this position, this is a pretty bad bishop here, blocked by this pawn, blocked by the knight as well, compared to white's great bishop, which has these two diagonals. White has more space as well. So the game continues with castling by both sides. And now we have an interesting move here. So often you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening. So we'll see how this turns out. Even the computer prefers rook to e1. So, what is the point behind this move? We'll find out. So now, knight to a5 is played. I guess because white moved a piece twice here as we go from the opening into the middle game, black decides to do the same. Maybe to try and just trade some material down. Because even though this knight is on the edge, it's threatening to trade the knight. So what does Botvinnik do? He just goes ahead and captures. That does help the queen develop, and there's going to be a battle here for this valuable outpost square. The queen is covering it now, the knight is covering it, and white has two pieces covering as well. So the game continues with the bishop to g5. So this is an important move. If you're going to try and fight for this outpost, and the knight is one of the defenders of that outpost, often this bishop can be given up in exchange for the knight, and it makes white's job of landing on this outpost with a great knight a little bit easier. And maybe another reason that this bishop moved here was to help protect this pawn, which was under a little bit of pressure by the knight. So the game continues with bishop developing and also helping fight for this outpost square here. And for any beginners that aren't familiar with what an outpost is, well, often it is a square that you can place a piece, like this knight, and if it's protected by a pawn, that's even better. And also you notice that black doesn't have a C or an E pawn that could move here or here to chase that knight away, or whatever piece lands on that outpost. So the game continues with pawn pushing forward, perhaps with the intention of attacking the queen and gaining space here in the future. So the game continues with the queen centralizing a little bit. And now we have white gaining a little bit of breathing room for his king, pushing forward, maybe preventing a piece from jumping here in the future, although this queen bishop battery is covering that pretty good. And also we notice the queen moved here, which is in line with the opponent's king, and that's often a good strategy to line up a piece on the king or a less valuable piece, lining it up on a more valuable piece, like a bishop or a rook lined up on the queen. Even though there's a pawn in between, you never know when things might open up. So the rook centralizes here, and now we have the queen stepping forward, backing up the bishop, and connecting the rooks. So now the rooks are free to move wherever they might be needed the most. Often, a rook will move here to help target this backward pawn, and that can be a weakness. So the game continues with h6, giving black some breathing room, attacking the bishop at the same time. So what does Botvinnik do? Well, he finally goes ahead and captures that knight, which was a great protector of the outpost square. So after recapture, we have the rook stepping to the center, adding a little more pressure to this backwards pawn, also trying to discourage that pawn from pushing to d5 and getting rid of that weakness. Often if black in the Sicilian defense can push their d pawn to d5, that kind of frees up their game and makes it a little bit easier for them to at least get a draw, if not, try and going in for a win. All right, so the game continues with rook moving to the half-open file, and now we have bishop jumping forward here, targeting this bishop. That way, if there's a capture by black, then it would pull this flank bishop, this rook pawn, pull this rook pawn towards the center, where it's doing a little bit more. So now we have, and also I might add that whenever your opponent has the bishop pair, usually it can be a good idea to trade off one of those bishops, especially if you do not have the bishop pair, like white just has a rook and a knight here, or a bishop and a knight versus two bishops. Okay, so the king comes towards the center, which is often very important as you head from the middle game into the end game. So now we have queen stepping to the side to back up the bishop. That way, if there is an exchange, There's also the option to capture with the queen, maybe. And now the queen gets out of the line of fire of black's rook. And perhaps maybe in the future, white can use the half-open d-file to double his rooks up. Okay, so the game continues with a pawn push on the queen side by black, perhaps with the intention of pushing forward, also maybe to keep the knight out. This a6 pawn move is a common move in the Sicilian defense, most typically seen, of course, in the Najdorf variation, but also in other variations as well. So queen moves here, lining up on the king. As I mentioned before, that can be a good strategy because you never know when things might open up and you have a discovered line on the opponent's king. All right, the rook steps forward, helping guard this backward pawn. And now we have a space-gaining move with h4 here. And at this point, the game is about even. Just a slight edge for white. Now, it looks like this pawn can just be snatched up here. Would that be a good idea? Probably not, because if that pawn, is captured here, well then you have this threat of capturing the bishop, and the pawn cannot recapture because there would be a pin. All right, so the king steps out of the line of fire there. Now there is a threat on that pawn. So we have g3 protecting the pawn. Black gained some space on the queen side. And now things continue with the rook centralizing, lining up on the queen. So the queen ignores that for the moment, stepping forward. And I believe this is the first mistake of the game, according to the computer. And the analysis shows that white has a +1 advantage at this point, even though material is still equal. So let's see what happens. And what should have been played? According to the computer, apparently queen to b6 is a little bit better. It backs the queen up, helps keep an eye on d6, the backward pawn, also this pawn over here on a6, and the rook as well. But after queen to c4, we have the best move being found by Botvinnik. He just brings his rook up, maybe with an intention of doubling the rooks and adding even more pressure. So the game continues with a pawn push. This is an inaccuracy. Now the computer likes queen to c5 better. So that is ignored, and we have a counter mistake by Botvinnik. b3 is played, but this is only a slight mistake. The computer prefers an immediate exchange of the light squared bishops, which would get rid of black's good bishop in favor of the bad bishop. And for any beginners, if you're not sure what a good and a bad bishop are, well, we see here black has a bad bishop because these pawns are on the same colored squares in the center, blocking that bishop. Whereas white's center pawn is this light squared bishop, so it limits the scope or the maneuverability of his own bishop. So it would be good to get rid of his bad light squared bishop in exchange for the good light squared bishop of black. All right, so we have a queen retreat here, another mistake. The computer prefers instead a counterattack on the queen here by capturing this bishop and attacking white's queen. So now we have, finally, the knight moves into the outpost here. So, if we look at this outpost, the knight is in a great position here, and knights are usually one of the best pieces to place on an outpost, especially if it's blockading a pawn here. So this pawn can't go anywhere. The knight is covering, all these squares. The king is in check, and You know, of course, the best move here is to immediately get rid of that knight on the outpost. But now we have the good bishop off the board in exchange for that pretty terrific knight and a recapture with an attack on the queen here. So the queen steps back to the best square, and it looks like potentially there could be a battle on this backwards pawn, but black does have two rooks, the queen and the king, all with the potential to guard that. Capture of the pawn by white, the queen recaptures. So material is still even, but according to the computer, there's a little over a +1 advantage for white here. So the game continues with queen to e2, trying to bring that queen back towards the center, lining up on this pawn, which of course the rook is protecting. And so now we have queen stepping forward, an inaccuracy. The computer just prefers king to f8, maybe getting the king a little bit safer, because usually you don't want to bring the kings out too far into the action while there's queens still on the board, because the queen could end up attacking your king and causing lots of problems. So with king to f8, that might also allow this bishop to drop back and really protect the backward d6 pawn. And we do have opposite colored bishops on the board, and they're often drawish because you have this light squared bishop able to control quite a few squares all over the board that black cannot counter, and the same for black's dark squared bishop. So one strategy could be to place your pawns on the opposite colored squares of your opponent's bishop, but then again, because these are opposite colored bishops, if white were to place all his pawns on the light squares, then it could possibly block his own bishop as well. So the game continues with a queen retreat, the best move in the position, helping to guard this c2 pawn. Also, maybe protecting the rook with a potential move, of sliding over. Also here, the queen is helping to keep pressure on that backward d pawn. Okay, the final moves in the game. Let's wrap this up. The next move is rook to b8. So now, what could be the threat behind this? Maybe capturing here. If you have recapture, then there might be a possibility of taking this rook. So, after capture, something like that. But we have that being ignored, a repositioning of the bishop here. So that's pretty interesting. So before I go on, now this is a great move according to the computer, because the bishop, it wasn't doing as much on this line. Here, it's getting ready to maybe reposition here, blocking the communication between this rook and queen battery. So what if, after this move, you have this move here? So capture. Well, I don't know. I'll go ahead and play it out just because it is a little bit interesting. Now let's see why this doesn't work. Well, you have this move, a counter attack here on the queen, and once that queen moves, you can just pick off the rook. So that doesn't work at the moment. All right, back to the game. We have the pawn pushing forward, and the bishop repositions to c4, cutting ties between the rook and the queen. So the game continues with the pawn pushing forward, the best move in the position, because this is a isolated rook pawn, pretty weak over here, and it's probably a good idea to try and get rid of that. So the rook steps over, eyeing that pawn. What will Botvinnik's opponent do? Well, apparently the best move in the position is to just keep pushing that pawn to a3. So, that's pretty interesting. We could take a look at that, because in the game this was played, and at this point white is almost winning. He's plus 3.3 here. So let's look and see why they like this move. If you push forward, apparently you don't want to take. They prefer rook to a2. If you do capture, let's see why this move is a blunder. You would have a rook capturing the bishop, and of course now if there's a recapture, well then the queen could snag that rook. So that wasn't played. Excuse me, let me go back a little further. After this move, we have the rook stepping forward, and Botvinnik takes advantage here, chasing that queen, which is really limited on where it can go. So it steps back to the only move, really. And now an attack on the rook. Rook captures bishop. So what else could have been possible to play here? The computer recommends capturing on b3. If the rook just steps back, let's say with something like this, well then what? Well, you don't want to do that, because then the bishop could jump into that great outpost, attacking both rooks. So what else? Rook to b8 maybe. So if you go all the way back, well then the recommendation is to just go ahead, capture this pawn for free now. All right, let's finish it out. We have a rook capture, which is what occurred in the game. And instead of recapturing here, and they actually say queen to b3 would have been better, but then the queens could have been exchanged. And it's not, it's already looking pretty bad. It's pretty much a losing for black at this point. So let's see how white finished up here. An attack on the queen. The queen steps over, and now rook protects the c4 pawn. So the game continues with rook moving behind the passed pawn, which is usually a great strategy. But the problem is the queen is just stuck here. Trapped. This queen can't really go anywhere. So the game continues with a pawn push. And, this is a good move, but the computer prefers rook to b7 check immediately here. But after this, a mistake that leads to mate in 3. But, no matter what, it's looking pretty grim for black at this point. So we have an attack on the rook, and that leads to a check. And this is where the game ended. Because, what can black do? It's a mate in 2, or a mate in 1. If the king steps forward, well, then the queen could just move here to the outpost. Oh, actually, can it? I forgot about this queen. So, king to e6, like this, there's an even crazier queen move. Queen to g4, protecting the rook and at the same time delivering a mate. So the king can't go to e6. So, what else can the king do? Well, there's only a couple options here. King to e8 or f8. And each one is pretty bad. If you go here, well, then you have what? rook to b8 check. So I guess I might as well play it out. Check. And now what? The only option is to block with the bishop. And of course, that can be captured with the win there. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that game. And, it's from 1953. So, quite a bit has changed, especially in opening since then. But that was still kind of an instructive game, especially on that battle for the outpost, which featured the weak backwards D pawn and that hole on D5. And just remember, a lot of times in the Sicilian defense, there's a battle for that important square on D5. So if I go back to the beginning here and we just take a quick look at how it progressed to the point right here, if I go back. So as soon as that pawn pushed forward, we're left with that big gap here on D5. Now, if black plays accurately, he can still play around this weak backward D6 pawn and this outpost potentially for white. But, we saw how black got in trouble here today. All right, well, feel free to leave comments, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.